After my husband Mike and my own sister murdered me, my soul stood in line at the Registry of the Dead. Rebirth and reincarnation, which family do you choose? The Grim Reaper flipped through his ledger, asking me with complete indifference. I looked up and pointed to the mirror of soul judgment which showed the wretched couple. They were hugging each other, celebrating that they had finally gotten rid of me. I smiled. Their family. I want to be the sweet fruit of their love. The Grim Reaper froze for a moment, warning me. My name was Marissa Vale. My husband Mike and my own sister Celeste killed me in an unfinished building on the edge of town, and the last thing I heard before the dark took me was Celeste asking whether anyone would believe I'd been depressed. I opened my eyes in a place with no sky, only a long grey line of souls stretching toward two black doors. A pale official sat behind a desk, flipping through a ledger thick enough to hold every name that had ever ended too soon. Marissa Vale. He didn't look up. Cause of death? Murder. He turned the page like I'd told him the weather. Unresolved rebirth and reincarnation, you may choose another family. Beside his desk hung a mirror that showed the living world. I looked into it before I even meant to, and there they were, Mike and Celeste, my husband and my sister, wrapped around each other in my own living room, laughing over champagne. She was wearing my necklace. Something in me went very quiet and very still. That family, I said, pointing. The official's pen stopped moving. You want to return to them? No. I kept my eyes on the mirror, on the two people who thought they'd gotten away with something. I want to be born as their daughter. He warned me. He told me rebirth would strip most of my memory, that I might grow up powerless inside the very house that had buried me, that choosing them meant choosing to watch it happen slowly from the inside and with nothing but time on my side. I chose them anyway. Because I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to understand how two people who claimed to love someone could destroy her this completely, and I wanted them to find out one day exactly who they'd let sleep down the hall. If you've ever loved someone who turned out to be a stranger wearing a familiar face, stay with me. This story is for you. Mike and Celeste got married less than a year after I died. They told everyone it had been complicated, that love doesn't wait for the right time, that no one should be blamed for feelings that couldn't be helped. People believed it. People always believed the ones who cry the prettiest. I was born into that story. They named me Elara Cross, and for a while, I was exactly what I looked like, a baby with no past, no memory, no idea that the two people cooing over my crib had once stood over my body, deciding how to explain it to the police. The house ran on rhythms I absorbed before I could name them. Mike's voice changed depending on who was listening, warm and easy at dinner parties, clipped and short the moment the door closed behind the last guest. Celeste filled every room she walked into, the same way she always had, laughing loud enough that no one thought to ask what she wasn't saying. I didn't understand any of it yet. I was just a child learning the shape of a family, which door stayed shut, which conversations dropped to whispers when I toddled into a room, which photographs existed only in frames and never in albums where anyone might look too closely. There was a locked drawer in Mike's study I wasn't allowed near. There was a storage box in the attic Celeste dusted but never opened. There was a name that came up once, quietly between my parents, and was never said again in front of me. None of it meant anything to a 3-year-old, but somewhere underneath the milk teeth and the naps and the small, ordinary days, something in me was already listening. Already remembering, in pieces too small to hold on to yet, already waiting for the moment a house full of secrets would finally hand one of them to me by accident. That moment was closer than either of them knew. My 5th birthday started with cake and ended with a memory that didn't belong to a 5-year-old. Celeste had pulled an old storage box down from the attic that morning, looking for a childhood photo of herself to compare against mine, some game about family resemblance she thought was cute. She got distracted by a phone call and left the box open on the living room floor. I wasn't supposed to touch it. I touched it anyway. Underneath a stack of old bank statements and a folded scarf, there was a photograph. A woman I didn't recognize, standing beside a half-finished building, sunlight cutting across her face, and behind her, half in shadow, unmistakably younger but unmistakably him, Mike. The moment I looked at his face in that photo, something in me split open. I remembered concrete dust and cold air. I remembered a hand closing hard around my arm. I remembered Celeste stepping out from behind a pillar with tears already sitting in her eyes like she'd rehearsed them. I remembered the exact sound of her voice when she whispered, "I'm sorry, Marissa," right before everything went dark. I sat on that living room floor holding a photograph of my own murder scene, and I understood all at once everything I was. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Some part of me, the part that had waited in a line of souls and made a choice with both eyes open, knew immediately that the worst thing I could do was let my face show what I now knew. Celeste came back into the room, phone still in her hand, and found me sitting exactly where she'd left me. "Find anything fun in there, sweetheart?" I looked up at the woman who had killed me and helped bury the woman I used to be, and I smiled the way a 5-year-old smiles when she isn't thinking about anything at all. "No," I said, "just old stuff." She smiled back, relieved, and put the box away. I went to bed that night in a room full of stuffed animals and nightlights, lying very still, holding a secret too heavy for a body that small. I understood with total clarity that the moment either of them suspected I remembered anything, I would stop being their daughter and start being their next problem. So I decided, right there in the dark, that I would simply become very good at being no one's problem at all. Once I knew what I was looking at, I couldn't stop seeing it. I started paying attention the way Marissa never had, not out of trust, but out of habit. I noticed that Mike checked his phone differently depending on which room he was standing in. I noticed that Celeste got quiet, almost careful, whenever certain paperwork came out of his study, the kind of quiet that only comes from knowing exactly what you're not supposed to react to. I was 6 the first time I heard them argue about money in the tight, controlled voices adults use when they think a child can't understand tone. I couldn't have explained what a shell company was, but I understood, the way children understand weather, that something about the numbers in that house didn't sit right, and that both of them knew it. I started finding reasons to be in rooms I wasn't really allowed in. Not sneaking, not yet just a curious kid trailing after her father while he worked. Quiet enough to be forgotten, present enough to see things left open on a desk for half a second too long. That's how I first saw the name. It was on an old folder tucked behind newer files Mike kept in a locked drawer he sometimes forgot to lock all the way. A name I'd never heard either of my parents say out loud. Not mine, not Celeste's, not anyone who came to our house for dinner. I didn't know yet why a name that meant nothing to me made my father's jaw tighten every time he touched that folder. I didn't know why it was filed with numbers instead of memories, tucked away like something meant to stay buried twice. But I knew what buried things looked like now. I'd been one myself. I closed the drawer exactly the way I'd found it and went back to being 6 years old, coloring quietly at the kitchen table while my parents built their careful, comfortable life on top of whatever that name was hiding. I didn't say anything and I didn't ask questions, I just added it carefully to the list of things I was patiently, silently learning to understand. Because somewhere in that locked drawer was the beginning of a story that started long before mine did, and I intended to find out exactly how far back it went. I was 8 years old when I found out my mother's murder wasn't the first time my father had done this. It took 2 years of patient, quiet watching to get there. I'd learned to read upside down across a desk, learned which afternoons Mike left his study unlocked while he took calls out on the terrace, learned to move through that house like I belonged in every room and suspected in none of them. The folder with the strange name finally gave up its secret on an ordinary Tuesday. Inside were old bank records, a missing persons flyer gone soft and yellow at the edges, and a date. I did the math twice before I let myself believe it. 11 years before I was born. Before Mike had ever met Marissa Vale. Before there was a Celeste in the picture at all. A woman had disappeared. Her name was on that flyer, on those bank records, tangled up in numbers that moved the exact same way the numbers around my own death had moved money sliding into accounts that didn't officially exist, then disappearing right along with her. I sat on the floor of that study with a dead woman's photograph in my small hands and understood something that turned my stomach in a way 5-year-old grief never had. Marissa hadn't been an accident of bad love or a marriage gone wrong. Marissa had been a repeat performance. My father had done this before, successfully, quietly, and walked away clean enough to do it again, which meant the man raising me, tucking me in, kissing my forehead at bedtime, wasn't a man who had made one terrible choice. He was a man with a method. I put the folder back exactly where I found it, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. Somewhere in this house or in whatever life that missing woman had left behind, there was a second story buried under mine, and I was starting to understand that finding out who she was might matter just as much as finding justice for who I used to be. If you've ever discovered that the person who hurt you had done it before, that you weren't the first, and the world just never noticed, I need you to stay with me for this one. Because Alara isn't going to look away, and neither should you. Subscribe, and let's find out together exactly how deep this goes. Once you know someone is capable of disappearing a person twice, you start watching them differently. I stopped seeing my father as a father, and I started seeing him as a study. At home with Celeste, Mike was warm in a way that looked almost convincing if you didn't know better, an easy hand on her shoulder, a soft laugh at her jokes, the kind of attention that made her visibly relax into herself. It was the same charm I imagined he'd once used on Marissa and probably on the woman before her. He was good at being loved, that was the whole danger of him. Outside those walls, he was someone else entirely. I watched him with the household staff, with contractors who came by about the business, with anyone who didn't have power over his comfort, and the warmth disappeared like it had never existed. His voice went flat, his patience went short. People who made small mistakes around him learned quickly not to make them twice. Celeste never seemed to notice the difference, or she'd trained herself not to. I noticed everything. I started keeping a mental list the way Marissa once kept paper records without knowing what she was really building, which version of Mike showed up in which room, which people got the charm and which got the cold, and exactly how easily he could switch between them without missing a breath. It struck me, watching him charm a room full of guests one night while dismissing a nervous new housekeeper with a single sharp look, that I finally understood something Marissa never had time to learn. He wasn't unpredictable, he was consistent. He simply reserved his cruelty for anyone who couldn't yet do anything about it, and his warmth for anyone who still could. I was 8 years old, and I already knew more about this man than either of the two women he'd destroyed had ever gotten the chance to learn. Marissa had trusted her instincts too late. I had time, I had memory, I had every advantage she never got, and unlike her, I wasn't planning on confronting him with questions. I was planning on watching him long enough to know exactly which mistake would finally be the one he couldn't charm his way out of. I found the business card by accident, tucked into the spine of an old ledger I wasn't supposed to be touching, and it changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. It was faded, cheap cardstock, the kind small companies print before they know if they'll last, a name I didn't recognize, an address that, when I looked it up years later on a school computer under the excuse of a homework project, belonged to a building that no longer existed. Folded behind it was a torn page from what looked like an old filing record, half a company name, a registration date, and a line struck through in Mike's handwriting, dissolved. I sat with that word for a long time. I already knew, from the folder with the missing woman's photograph, that money had moved strangely around her disappearance. I already knew, from pieces Marissa herself had gathered before she died, that money had moved the exact same way around her murder shell companies, private accounts, transfers dressed up to look like nothing at all. Now I was holding proof that this particular method, the specific shape of it, had a paper trail stretching back to a company Mike had quietly closed down years before Marissa ever existed in his life. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a pattern with a signature, and the signature was his. Which meant the real question wasn't whether my father had done this before. I already knew that. The real question was how many times, how many women, how many folders like the one gathering dust in his study, and whether Marissa had been a woman he loved and destroyed, or simply a method he'd already perfected and was repeating on schedule. I put the card back exactly where I'd found it, my hands steady, my mind anything but. For the first time since that photograph on my 5th birthday, I understood that I wasn't just uncovering my own murder, I was uncovering a career. If you've ever found out that the person who hurt you had a pattern, that you were never the exception, just the latest name on a list, I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because Ilara is about to. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel for, and if it's speaking to something in you too, stay close. Subscribe now, because what she finds next is going to change how you see everyone in this house. It happened over something as small as dinner. Celeste liked to fill silence with stories about people she'd known, old co-workers, old friends, women who'd drifted out of her life for one reason or another. She was good at it. The way she was good at everything performed in front of an audience. I used to think it was just her being social. Now I understood it was armor. A woman who talks constantly rarely has to answer real questions. That night, half listening, I said the name. I hadn't planned it. It slipped out of me almost carelessly, dropped into a lull in her story like I was simply free associating the way kids do. The name from the missing woman's flyer, said out loud at our dinner table for the first time in my life. Celeste's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. It was less than a second. If I hadn't spent 3 years learning exactly how this woman's face worked, I would have missed it entirely. The flicker of something behind her eyes, gone almost before it arrived, replaced instantly by a laugh, a half-beat too loud for whatever she said next to cover it. "Where did you hear that?" she asked, still smiling, reaching for her wine like the question meant nothing. I shrugged the way an 8-year-old shrugs. "I don't know, I think I read it somewhere." She let it go. Mike didn't even look up from his plate. The conversation moved on to something else, easy and forgettable, exactly the way Celeste wanted it to. But I'd seen what I needed to see. She knew that name. Not vaguely, not in passing, she knew it the way you know something you've spent years making sure never gets said out loud in your own house, and the fact that she recognized it meant her involvement in whatever happened to that woman didn't start with me. It started before Marissa. Maybe before she'd even fallen in love with Mike, or convinced herself that's what this was. I finished my dinner like nothing had happened because that was the whole point of watching instead of confronting. Celeste thought she'd smoothed over a strange moment at the table. She had no idea she'd just handed her own daughter the first real crack in a story two people had spent over a decade building. I was 11 years old the first time I found a version of myself I didn't remember becoming, and it happened while I was digging through old family files for a school project on our family history, an assignment so ordinary it should have led nowhere. Instead, buried in a box of documents Mike kept for tax purposes, I found a name that stopped me cold. Rebecca Sloan, attorney. I didn't recognize the name from anything Mike or Celeste had ever mentioned, but something in me recognized it anyway, not as new information, but as a memory trying to surface from underneath a life I hadn't lived as Alara. I remembered a woman with a sharp, careful voice. I remembered sitting across from her, being told not to confront anyone, to keep collecting evidence quietly and let the proof speak for itself. I remembered feeling, for the first time in months, like survival might actually be possible. I hadn't hired Rebecca Sloan as Alara. Alara was 11 years old and had never needed a lawyer for anything, but Marissa had. Marissa had walked into her office and asked for help, and Marissa had been told the exact strategy I'd been quietly running for years without ever consciously deciding to run it. Watch, document, don't confront, let them convict themselves with their own paper trail. I hadn't invented that plan. I'd remembered it. My whole approach to this house, to my own parents, had been built on instructions given to a version of me who never got the chance to use them. It rattled me more than any folder or flickering flinch across a dinner table ever had, because it meant the line between who I used to be and who I was now wasn't as clean as I told myself it was. Marissa wasn't just a memory I carried. She was still, somehow, making decisions through me. I sat with that file in my lap for a long time before I put it back exactly where I'd found it, the way I'd learned to put everything back. Somewhere out there, if she was still practicing, was a woman who had once tried to save my life and never found out whether it worked. And someday I understood, sitting there in that quiet room full of other people's secrets, I might have to walk back into her office and finish what Marissa never got the chance to start. If you've ever felt like some part of your past was quietly steering your present without asking permission first, I think you understand exactly what this moment cost Ilara. Stay with her. Subscribe, because the next piece of this puzzle is the one that finally tells her who helped bury the truth the first time. Every trail I'd followed so far had led somewhere. This was the first one that led nowhere, and that told me more than any document ever could. I spent the better part of a year in stolen hours between homework and the ordinary business of being a teenager, laying the two disappearances side by side in my head like transparencies over each other. The missing woman from 11 years before my first life, Marissa's murder. Same shape, same rhythm. Money moved into accounts that didn't officially exist, then vanished the same week the woman did. But when I traced the financial fingerprints back as far as they'd go, they stopped at a date that made no sense. A transfer, structured exactly like the ones I recognized, dated years before Mike had any known business, any known company, any known access to the kind of money it would take to make a person disappear that cleanly. Mike hadn't built that method alone. Someone had shown him how, or done it with him, back when he was too young and too unestablished to have pulled it off by himself. That meant there was another name in this story. Someone who'd helped him bury the first woman and then simply stepped back, content to let Mike carry the method forward on his own, confident enough in the arrangement that they never needed to be involved again. Celeste didn't fit. She'd come into his life years after that first disappearance, according to everything I'd pieced together. Which meant before Celeste, before Marissa, before any of the women whose names ended up in folders in that study, there had been someone else in my father's life. Someone patient, someone still, very possibly close enough to this family that I'd already sat across a dinner table from them without knowing what I was looking at. I closed the file, my hands cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Marissa had believed she was the exception, the mistake, the one relationship that had gone wrong. She never got to learn she was one entry in a method someone else had taught her husband long before she ever said yes to him. I intended to find out exactly who that teacher was and whether they were still close enough to reach. I found him hiding in plain sight at every holiday I could remember, smiling in the family photos I'd grown up walking past without ever really looking at them. His name was Walter Graves. He'd been at every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every quiet Sunday dinner for as long as I could remember. Mike's old business mentor, the man who'd apparently given him his start decades ago, back before any of the companies I'd been tracing even had names. Everyone called him family. He brought me a gift every year without fail. Always something thoughtful, always something that made the other adults comment on what a kind man he was. I found his name buried in the earliest financial record I'd been able to trace, the one from before Mike had any business of his own, the one connected to the very first disappearance. Walter's signature was on documents that had nothing to do with kindness. He hadn't just mentored my father in business, he'd mentored him in exactly how to make a woman disappear and dress the money trail up as something else entirely. I sat with that for longer than I sat with almost any other discovery in this whole search, because unlike the folders and business cards, Walter wasn't a name on paper. Walter was a man who had knelt down at my 6th birthday party to hand me a wrapped gift and tell me I had my father's eyes. Walter was a man who had sat 2 seats down from me at every holiday table since I was born, patient and warm, playing the role of trusted family friend while knowing exactly what he'd taught the man across from him. Every helpful gesture recast itself the moment I understood what he actually was. The business advice he gave Mike over dinner wasn't friendship. It was maintenance, a teacher checking in on a student who'd taken his lesson further than he probably ever expected. The way he always seemed to know exactly what to say to smooth over a tense moment at the table wasn't warmth. It was practice. The same instinct for controlling a room that Mike had clearly learned from him first. Mike and Celeste had never been an isolated betrayal, one bad marriage gone wrong. They were the second act of something someone else had already rehearsed with him once before, patiently, successfully, and was still close enough to the family to watch the second performance from the best seat in the house. I thought about all the years I'd spent cataloging my parents' every inconsistency, convinced they were the whole story. They weren't. They were students of someone who had never once been suspected, who had built himself a permanent, welcomed place in the very family he'd helped create through violence. I understood, sitting there with Walter's signature staring back at me from a document decades old, that my plan had just gotten considerably more complicated. It wasn't enough anymore to expose Mike and Celeste. If I only took down the two of them, the man who'd taught them how to do this in the first place would simply walk away clean, exactly the way he had the first time, ready to mentor whoever came next. That wasn't going to happen. Not while I was the one who finally knew what he was. I stopped watching and started building. Everything I'd gathered over the years, the dissolved shell company, the 11-year-old disappearance, Walter's signature buried in records that predated my father's entire career, the fragments of Rebecca Sloane's old strategy still guiding me without my permission, all of it had been sitting in my head like evidence with nowhere to go. Observation had taught me the shape of what happened. It was never going to be enough to end it. So I did the thing Marissa never got the chance to do. I stopped being patient and started being deliberate. I found Rebecca Sloane's name in an old bar association directory and reached out under the kind of pretext no one questions from a curious teenager. A school project on family law, an interest in legal history, the harmless curiosity of a girl who liked to read. She had no idea her new correspondent already knew exactly how she took her coffee and exactly what advice she'd once given a woman named Marissa Vale. I requested access to old public filings a normal 16-year-old had no reason to want. I framed every question as academic interest, every document request as a school assignment, every late night spent cross-referencing shell companies as a hobby, a little strange but nothing anyone in that house thought worth interrupting. Mike found it mildly amusing, even proud, that his daughter had developed an interest in business structures. Celeste barely noticed at all. That was exactly what I needed them to think. I let them keep underestimating me the same way they'd underestimated Marissa, the same way I now understood. Walter had underestimated every woman he'd ever helped erase, confident that none of them would ever be smart enough or connected enough to trace it back to him. I built my case in full view of the people I was building it against, disguised as nothing more than a curious kid with an unusual hobby, while quietly assembling the exact combination of records, dates, and signatures that would eventually make denial impossible for all three of them. It was strange doing this work as Ilara instead of Marissa. Marissa had gathered evidence out of fear, hoping it would be enough to save her if things went wrong. I gathered mine with something closer to patience because I already knew exactly how far these people were willing to go when they felt cornered, and I had no intention of letting any of them see me coming until it was already too late to stop. Some nights, closing my laptop after hours of cross-referencing old filings, I thought about how strange it was to be quietly building a case against my own father at a desk 15 feet from the room where he tucked me in every night, believing I was simply his daughter. He had no idea he was raising his own reckoning. Neither did Celeste. Neither, most importantly, did Walter. I intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as it took to make sure none of them ever saw the moment coming when I finally decided to use everything I had. I chose the family attorney's annual review dinner for the same reason Mike had once chosen an unfinished building. It was the one setting where no one would expect the walls to come down. Every year the family gathered with Rebecca Sloane's firm to go over the estate, the trusts, the paperwork of a family that liked to believe its foundations were solid. Mike sat at the head of the table, comfortable in a room he thought he controlled completely. Celeste sat beside him, relaxed in the way people get when they've spent years believing their worst mistakes are permanently behind them. Walter had a seat too, the same warm, trusted presence he'd occupied at every family gathering of my entire life. I'd spent months arranging for exactly this configuration of people in exactly this room. When the formal business wound down, I asked, in the mild, curious voice I'd perfected over years of being underestimated, whether anyone at the table recognized a name. I said it clearly, into a silence that hadn't expected to be interrupted, and watched it land on 3 faces at once: the missing woman's name, followed immediately by Marissa's. Mike went still, in a way I'd never seen him go still before. Walter's easy expression flickered, just once, exactly the way Celeste's had years earlier at that dinner table. But it was Celeste who broke first. She always had been the one who couldn't carry silence for long. She turned on Mike immediately, years of buried resentment finally finding a target, insisting she'd only helped because he'd promised her it would never come back on either of them, that he'd handled everything before with Walter and it had worked fine then too. She said it fast, frightened, trying to place herself as the smaller crime in a room that had just learned there was a bigger one. She didn't realize until it was already out of her mouth that she'd just confirmed everything in front of the one witness none of them had ever accounted for. Me. Mike's face went through something I'd waited over a decade to see. The exact moment a man who has spent his whole life controlling every room he's in finally understands he's lost this one completely. Walter reached for calm, for an explanation, for the practiced warmth that had smoothed over every uncomfortable moment at every dinner I could remember. It didn't work this time. Nothing works on people who already know the ending. I sat there, 16 years old, watching the 3 of them unravel each other in real time, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel after all these years of waiting. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that, something closer to relief. If you've ever sat across from the people who hurt you and finally said the one thing you'd been carrying in silence for years, you already know this feeling doesn't look the way movies make it look. It's not loud, it's not even satisfying, not right away. It's just true, finally, out loud in front of witnesses who can't take it back. If that's ever been you, tell me in the comments. I want to know how it felt when your silence finally became someone else's problem. What happened after that dinner moved faster than 16 years of silence had any right to move. Once Celeste's words were on record, the rest came apart quickly. Investigators pulled the thread I'd spent years assembling: the shell company, the 11-year-old disappearance, the financial fingerprints connecting all of it back to Walter and forward to Marissa. He'd stayed hidden for decades by never being the one whose name sat on top of anything. My records put him underneath everything instead. Mike's business collapsed under the weight of accounts that could no longer explain themselves. Custody proceedings began almost immediately, complicated by a teenage daughter who had somehow, impossibly, already assembled the case against her own parents. Celeste tried, briefly, to recast herself as another of Mike's victims, but the recordings and records didn't leave room for that story. She had been useful to him once. Useful didn't mean innocent. I watched people who had once celebrated my birth as the healing of their tragic, misunderstood love story now scramble through lawyers and statements, each of them trying to prove they'd been less guilty than the other. Walter, the man who'd handed me birthday gifts for 16 years, disappeared from every family photograph the same way his first victim once had, except this time, someone had kept the records. I didn't feel joy watching it happen. I felt something steadier. The particular calm of a debt finally being paid slowly, correctly, by people who'd spent their whole lives assuming it never would be. 2 years after that dinner, I walked into a prison visitation room for the first time, and I finally understood I didn't need anything the person on the other side of that glass could give me. Mike looked smaller than I remembered him being at the head of any table. He said my name like it still belonged to him. I let him finish, because I wanted to hear exactly what a man says when he's run out of rooms to control. "I'm still your father," he said. I almost smiled. "No, you're just the reason I learned how to wait." I didn't visit Celeste. There was nothing left to confirm there that the record hadn't already said better than she ever could. What I did instead that same year was find the file that still carried Marissa's name. The closed case, finally marked resolved instead of unresolved, sitting quiet in a records office that had no idea what it had taken to get those 2 words changed. I read it once, slowly, the way you read something that used to be a wound and has finally become just a fact. I didn't feel her anymore, not the way I had at 5 years old holding a photograph that broke me open. I felt myself, 18, whole, built out of everything she survived but no longer needing to carry her name to prove it. I closed the file and walked out into a life that finally, completely belonged to me. If you've ever had to fight your way back to yourself after someone tried to erase you, I hope this story made you feel less alone in it. Subscribe, because there are more women like her waiting to tell you exactly how they got their power back.